Hello and welcome to the Volleycast. I am your host, Joe Trinzi, and on the other line, Shannon Winzer from Canada. Shannon, how
Thanks,
you doing?
Joe. I'm good. I'm good. How are you doing?
Doing good, all things considered. Shannon is, I don't even know like necessarily what your official title is, but I'm going to call you like the Swiss Army knife of Team
Yeah.
Canada Volleyball. Basically, national team assistant, the next gen program head, high performance tryout runner, evaluator, coach, clinic instructor. Basically, really one of, if not the driving person behind Canadian women's volleyball, I think. And
Oh, hey,
more importantly, just a good person and a good friend. So good to see you doing well, Shannon.
thanks, Joe. I appreciate it. You make me sound a little bit more important than I am, but thanks. I appreciate it. Swiss Army knife is a really good call.
I like it. Uh, so just a couple announcements. We had our premium webinar today with Chris Thomas breaking down setting. So that was really good. That sold out a little while ago, but we'll put the recording up for sale. Anybody wants to check that out, you can go on scoutvb.com. Recording this on Friday, so we'll post this on Saturday. And so by the time you post this, the link for that should be up. Our next premium webinar next weekend is with Alfie Reft, new associate head coach at University of San Diego, a guy I know really well, just awesome teacher of the defensive skills, former national team libero himself. That's on Saturday the 11th. There is 5 spots as of the time we're recording this. So if you're interested in doing that, sign up now. Remember, we kind of keep the spots limited to 20 coaches so we can make these webinars actually like a dialogue and a real Q&A session rather than just a presentation with 100 people that don't get to talk. So only 5 more spots left for Alfie Reft. And I haven't put the link up yet, but we've locked in Dan Fisher, head coach of University of Pittsburgh, for our webinar after that on Sunday the 19th. So he's going to break down a lot of stuff about attacking. So a lot of cool stuff and a lot of coaches. We've been having like a lot of great dialogue on this. A lot of coaches going stir crazy, now that they can't be in the gym. So it's a good time to talk to a lot of great coaches. And we got a great coach on the line here with Shannon. And we've been texting back and forth, and that's my main strategy with the podcast is just all my coaching friends. I'm fortunate enough to know so many great coaches all around, and we start having text conversations. And I feel like I'm just like, I don't know if like I'm like the go-to like volley nerd that a lot of people text and is like, hey, Trinzi, I'm brainstorming about this. Like, what do you think? So what are you brainstorming right now? And so how did our text conversation start, Shannon?
Yeah, for sure. You definitely, I think my text did start with, I have a nerd question for you. Well, I guess like I was mentioning before, I was part of a really cool workshop in Canada with Own the Podium, and they're sort of our funding body, and it's all around planning and how we think through, basically high performance planning. Now, the next gen group I work with are the athletes who are, 4 to 8 years out of podium performance. And we're trying to do a gap analysis. So where my questions came into you is, okay, we're looking at 2 things. We're looking at our gold medal profile, which is the physicality, the things we can test for. Those things are, not as, that's probably not what I nerd questioned out with you for. The second one is our winning style of play. So if we're looking at gaps in our winning style of play, I guess I want to look at what gaps should we be looking at. Obvious ones are, our side out percentage, our break point percentage. But should we also be looking at number of games the national team's playing, age of the athlete? Are there other factors we should consider? And then who should we be comparing against? Is it just the top 12? Should we narrow it down and go, okay, top 4 and then top, 5 to 8? Should we look beyond the top 12? So I just had a lot of questions I wanted to talk through, what should we be looking at and who should we be, who is it relevant to?
Yeah, I think this is such like a cool topic because like literally this is what every coach does in the off season, no matter what level. It's like literally if you're coaching like a high school team, every NCAA program is doing this and even national teams are doing this. It's like just the constant search to try to figure out like how to get on top. And then as soon as you get on top, it's like the constant search to better yourself because everybody else is trying to knock you off. And I definitely think it's worth, you mentioned it's almost like this sort of like demographic analysis. I definitely think that it's worth looking at that. For example, like university teams, I definitely, on the Chris Thomas webinar, for example, we were just talking about like, can you win in the NCAA running a 6'2"? Like legally you can do it and you have substitutions and all that. But it's like, could you actually recruit high enough quality setters that we're going to want to go and share the load? And, maybe the answer is yes, maybe the answer is no. I think probably, to be honest, I think the answer is no on that. And, in terms of like international volleyball and stuff, I definitely think it's worth looking at factors like how much does experience seem to matter?
Yep.
For something like how much does size seem to matter?
Yep.
I think it's worth looking at factors like how many matches has this particular group played with together? Like, for example, in women's volleyball and international volleyball, I thought that was a real strength of the Serbian team this past quad. They really improved a lot from World Championships in 2014 through the Olympic Games in 2016. And it really wasn't, I don't know if it was like a personnel, they didn't really add personnel. They had a similar group. And I thought they like really grew and came into their own. And, it just makes me wonder if that's something worth looking at. And kind of get to one of the tricky factors in a second, but I think this stuff is worth investigating. And I think it's really worth us as coaches trying to examine what our existing biases are. Like, for example, like if we tend to favor veteran teams, I think it's really worth trying to examine if veteran teams are actually better or not. They very well may be. So I'm not saying that they aren't, but it's entirely possible. Like for example, in some sports they've shown, like for example, professional sports leagues, they've shown that playoff experience doesn't seem to really matter. Like meaning players, if it's their first time in the playoffs, they do just as well as players who've been in the playoffs 3 times. And in some other sports, maybe they've found correlations that it seems to matter. So I don't, that's something that I haven't looked at. But I think like if you're in this position of you're preparing like the next generation of it basically it's like above a junior national team for sure, the program that you're running. I would say at least compared to like how the American junior national team, which is not necessarily really, sorry, USA Volleyball, it's not really necessarily connected to the national team. But like the program that you're running is like really directly, I mean, for example, we called players up from the next gen team with Team Canada to play for the senior team. So like you have like this really connected with the ideal that the players that are there now are players that are going to be making a push for the 2024 Olympics. And I think that's something that is worth looking at. I think certainly on an international spectrum, that's one thing that stands out to me is like, is there some sort of threshold that they need to play a certain amount of major tournaments together? Does that matter or does it not matter?
Yeah. And the other thing that I know, like coming out of when I was coaching in Australia, the former men's national team coach used to always throw out a number like every national team needs to play a minimum of, I forget whether it was like 35 or 40 international games a year. And then I'm like, okay, where did that number come from? Is that an assumption or is that a number that, some analysis was done around that? So is there a consistency among the top teams about how much they're playing? And then you can look at, the number of, if they're playing together or, okay, you look at your top players, how many games did they play as 18 and 19-year-olds on the international stage? One of the things I think in Canada that we've struggled with is a lot of our players, are their first time playing international volleyball is post NCAA, post college, post U Sport. So they're getting their first experiences at, 22, 23 years old, and then we're playing catch up. Well, some of these top countries, are they getting those experiences a lot earlier? And I mean, there's so much you can track here. There's so much you could look at. How can I be really purposeful in at what I'm looking at? I guess that's my nerd questions for you.
Yeah. So I think that there's a couple things here that it makes me think of. Number one, it's difficult to prove. There's only so many things that you'll get definitive data on. So that's kind of one of the things is like, I want to try to separate what I can really get concrete data on versus the things that are more like a preference or a mental model for me. Yep. And I don't say that to diminish like coaches' preferences and mental models, because it's the nature of sports is like, and statistics and data can only measure what has happened and what has mattered. So you have to have a certain amount of using your judgment and experience. Like for example, your coaching colleague, and I haven't even mentioned this, Shannon was the former head coach of the Australian team. She, so she's got some great experience from there. And so you kind of know what it's like to compete at the international level, like what these players need. And now like the goal is to go from competing at the international level to qualifying for the Olympics. Like that's what Canada's, at least on the women's side, hasn't made that breakthrough in a long time. Mm-hmm. And there are certain things that you're just going to have to make your preference. Like you're talking about your coaching friend from Australia. Okay, his preference is for a certain amount of veteran players. I think there's like nothing wrong with that. And maybe he can't prove it, but he's like, okay, I'm going to sort of like just fix that and then look for the other factors. So first of all, what I would say is like, it's okay if your scope is a little bit limited. And I would say like, you also have to consider your strengths and weaknesses as a coach. We'll get into like some of the technical aspects of play, but it could be that like, if your strength of your development, for example, is blocking, well, it sure would help if you fit players that were going to be able to meet your strengths as well. So I think that's something to think about. Okay, so it's okay to have like, you're not going to figure out and like solve every piece of the puzzle with data and analytics. And then the other factor that you want to balance is like, I would like to do this analysis looking at maybe like more than one Olympic Games, or even looking at women's teams and men's teams, for example, because one of the things that international volleyball is particularly fraught with is there's just not that many teams, and there's just not that many teams that make the Olympics, for example, which means one or two highly successful teams can really skew this sort of analysis. So what you're going to get is I think the way that you would do it is, I think you can get the profile of several different teams, and you can use that to make some judgments on. So what I mean by that is, there's 12 teams that are going to qualify for this Olympics. Unfortunately, Canada is not one of them. We came up just a little bit short. And rather than try to do something like the average age in the 2016 Olympics, 2020 Olympics, 2021 Olympics. Oh, geez. Yeah. It kills me to say that. That's such a bummer. Rather than say like the average age in the 2021 Olympics is 24 or 25. Yeah. Because if the average age is 25, but that means half the players are 30 and half the players are 20, like that doesn't tell you anything about what a 25-year-old can do. Right. So what I would do is almost separately build a profile of each team in the Olympics. And for a team like Canada, which is more, I would arguably say, in like in the challenger sort of section of it, you may even eliminate, well, I'll put an asterisk next to this, but may even eliminate a program like USA, because they're a well-established team that's qualified many times and is in medal contention. Or you may eliminate a team like China, because the comparisons might not be as relevant. Whereas the teams that may be stronger challengers or comparisons for Canada may be the Dominican Republic, may be, I'm totally blank. Maybe like South Korea.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I was going to say, that was one of the things I was going to ask is, then is it worthwhile if removing, how the qualifiers, we have the intercontinental qualifiers, or the people who qualified through that. And those are, your really highly ranked teams. And then you got the ones who qualify through continental, which is your South Korea, Argentina, Turkey, Dominican. Are you better off comparing against them? And then all of a sudden my brain went to this space of, okay, well, it would make more sense to go after the teams that qualified through their continent. But then there's this talk that the qualifiers are all going to change. And then how relevant does your continental teams become? So then I felt like there's just, the more I thought about it, the more confusing I made it for me.
No, I think that you're thinking about it exactly the right way, because the answer to that is all of the above, yes. And I'll come back to the asterisk I placed by USA. It could be that USA is a highly relevant program for Canada, because they both share the fact that many of their players are going to go play in 4-year, or in Canada's case, even 5-year collegiate programs where they're going to be somewhat detached from the national team, and then they'll come back. So the average age where they're really seeing major international play for the first time could be 22 or 23, as opposed to a program like China where their players are going to see major international play at 17 or 18. So it could be that USA is highly relevant.
Okay.
So in one sense, maybe they're not, but in one sense, maybe they are. So what I mean by that is I would build profiles of, at the minimum, all 12 teams that make the 2021 Olympics, and if possible, all 12 teams that made the 2016 Olympics as well. And when you build each of those teams' profiles, you can probably then mix and match them and categorize them in several different ways. You can separate them out by teams that qualified world, teams that qualified intercontinental, teams that are veteran teams, teams that are youthful teams, because it may be that you don't have a choice whether Team Canada is going to be a young team or a veteran team in 2024. The players may dictate that for you. If all your best players are 23, guess what? You're going to have a young team in the Olympics. You're not just going to take some 32-year-olds because you won. I mean, if you're a smart coach, and vice versa. Like, for example, Brazil had a very old team in the 2016 Olympics, and that was not the wrong choice for them. That was their best players. And to be honest, they were just maybe a little too old. And that's the timing of that's the timing of the 4-year cycle. Brazil was at their peak probably in 2014. And it wasn't like they had a time machine. They had to kind of dance with who brought them. Now the flip side, a team like Italy was arguably at their peak as well in 2014. And they deliberately chose to play so many younger players in the Olympics, and for sure didn't do as well in the Olympics as they could have, because I think that they were, in some sense, gambling on developing those players for the next quad, to some extent. So what I mean is, I think that look how you're approaching it by, well, what if I looked at this subsection of teams? What if I looked at this classification of teams? What if I categorize them in this way? I think that's exactly the way. I think that's a much better way of approaching it than just saying, okay, average age is this, average height is this. Because, okay, throw Japan in there. Throw Japan and China in the same bucket. It's going to be totally irrelevant what the average height is, because the playing style is also different. So I would build those profiles and start comparing, and which one might be the most favorable, and look at the gaps between the different profile where Canada's at and those different profiles, because I think then you'll be able to see, oh, we have the shortest road to this,
Yeah. No, I like that, because I think that if we look at team profiles and then we look at, okay, and you sort of rank them, like you said, of how they qualified or where they sit or how they're relevant to Canada, I think that really plays into our gold medal profile, the physical, but also those other factors to a team, not just the skills and the statistical percentages, but now we're looking at the other factors. I think that really relates back to our gold medal profile, and it's very much related to your winning style of play. Okay, well, what does your play look like based on the factors that you really can't fully control, but you can then identify with certain countries and see what they're doing and how they're doing it as well. So I like that. That's a lot of work, but that's good.
Yeah, you just, I know you don't have enough work on your plate, so,
Hey, this is the fun time. This is when we get a chance to do all the things that we don't have a lot of time for throughout the year. So I've got time right now.
There you go. Yeah, and kind of like what you were saying, kind of adding to like the sort of now like technical pieces of volleyball is I would look at, the teams, which ones would maybe be more of, for lack of a better term, like a strong offensive team, which one, for lack of a better term, is a very strong defensive team, as a, high in the break point, low opponent side out, which ones would classify as more balanced, and so to some degree you'll have to like get an average side out percentage, an average break point percentage, and then you can just kind of see like, okay, this team is, like, for example, in the last Olympic Games, China, strong offensive team, USA, strong offensive team, Serbia, relatively strong defense, relatively, for how good they were, relatively average side out team, but very strong breakpoint team, for example. So you kind of classify by that broad strength and weakness. Within offense, like those three factors that I always look at are passing, in system attacking, and out of system attacking. And if you look at that, you look at USA, very strong passing team, very strong in system team. Serbia, very strong out of system team. China, very strong, relatively weak passing team, but very strong attacking in system and out of system. Looking at something like that, looking at, and then within defense, are they strong serving? Are they strong blocking? Are they strong digging? Within serving, are they strong because they serve in a lot and they serve very accurately? Are they strong within serving because they serve for aces?
But you with serving, just to stop you on that, with serving, would you look at then? So we're looking at your serving percentage, but then you'd look at maybe what I would call, hopefully it makes sense to you, transition percentage. So how long your serve is on the line for. Would you look at that as well then?
Yeah. That's what I would use for like the overall like effectiveness of my serving. And then like broadly speaking, I would think like serving in versus serving tough. So like, right. Basically broadly speaking, like, is this team strong because they serve in or because they serve tough, and like, just kind of like, so some of that's getting into a little bit of like standards development. Like, okay, clearly you can't serve it at 80%, qualify for the Olympics in women's volleyball. At least no team has really ever done it. So that would be just some like basic standards like that. But then just kind of like that broad feel for like strengths and weaknesses,
Yeah.
These teams seem to rely more on the serving. Do they rely more on their blocking? Do they rely more on their digging? Again, like looking at last quad, for example, like Serbia, relatively average to below average digging team, but very strong serving and blocking team, for example. China or Japan, for example, very poor blocking team, strong serving, very strong digging team. USA, we were a strong serving team, not a particularly strong blocking team, and a fairly strong digging team. Italy, fairly weak blocking team, strong digging team. So like, just looking at those various profiles, and I think it's probably something where you just kind of, I don't know, like get the pieces and look at them and kind of see. And then I think that there's going to be a degree of like, okay, considering our strengths as Canadian volleyball, what we have in the pipeline, but then also knowing like there's a degree of unpredictability in player development. So can we develop I don't know if style of play is quite the right way to say it, but can we develop like a overall like philosophy, which, Volleyball Canada, the national team already has a lot of those pieces, but can we have a developmental philosophy that plays in well to our inherent strengths as country, culture, volleyball program, et cetera,
And that's why I think like throughout coaching, I know like most of my international coaching was in Asia, but I've always admired teams like Japan because they're, to me, like the epitome of a team that understands their strengths and weaknesses and develops their winning style of play based on their strengths. Like they're not trying to copy. They're not trying to do what other teams are doing. They're going, this is what we're really good at. We're great at recycling. We're great at digging the ball. This is what we're going to recruit for. This is what we're going to develop. This is how we're going to play. And it's really cool to watch a team like them be successful. But yeah, so I don't even know where I was going.
And I would look at a program like China, which obviously just has like a tremendous overall like developmental push. I thought they made a deliberate, it looked to me at least like a post 2012, they made an effort to actually change some of their style of play to what appeared to me like an extreme emphasis on size and getting the biggest players on the court, getting their ball control good enough to maintain, and then keeping their bodies healthy enough to stay on the court. So you just look at the size of Chinese teams previous, and if you look at how they, in the last 8 years, for example, they're so big and so physical, and then you have all the factors. Okay, so what do we need to do to change our program, or how do we need to accommodate to have that size be a strength and then support it? So I think that looks, I don't know, that's my outside eye, of course, like for any, something like that, and like a team like South Korea is going to really have to change probably a lot of things because they've been so dominant based on one player. Like, are they going to shift their training style when Kim retires, or are they going to keep it the same? So, there's not like necessarily a right answer, but there's like a best plan for now, I think is also what you'll get.
Yeah, and that's all I'm really looking for is doing a gap analysis, is just making sure that we're staying on the right path and we're doing our best to get on the right path. And I think you hit it on the head. Like, there's so many unknowns with development and identification, development, recruitment, all those things that we just do our best to make sure we're headed in the right direction, and we're making informed decisions on, you know, what we're recruiting for, what we're looking for, what we're going to put emphasis on when we're training. Just making those educated decisions. And I think a gap analysis is, you know, just that piece of the puzzle I think we need right now. I know with next gen, to make sure we're headed on the right path, that we can best support the A team going forward. And I want to make sure that we have that information. So I figured we'd start with this.
No, I love it. And you know what? I think there's like one final piece that I would kind of add to this is like, and this, because this kind of stuff is something that, you know, coaches at every level, you know, like you're a national team coach and you're doing this. Collegiate teams are looking at their conference. Okay, how do I get to the top of the conference? Or maybe they made the national tournament. How do I get closer to the national championship? And like even high school teams should be doing this. Okay, how do I get to the top of my conference? So everybody, there's always kind of like a natural fixation. It's totally understandable on like, how do we succeed? But I think it's also worth looking at, for lack of a better term, like looking at the teams that suck and understanding why they suck, you know, because one of the ways to be good is to not be bad, you know? So I think that there's a lot of, use in that. And for like, just for example, like this is definitely something that I've seen in business circles where business coaches or writers or successful business people say, okay, you want to study businesses that succeed. But if you only look at businesses that succeed, you're also prone to looking at like survivorship bias. So you might look at these 3 businesses that were successful and say, okay, I'm going to copy them. But if 100 other businesses tried the same thing and failed, then you could just be hoping to get lucky, for example. So sometimes for me, like that's just a mental model that sort of inverts it. Is like, okay, I'm going to look at the successful programs and try to understand why they're successful. But it'd also be nice if I looked at the unsuccessful programs. And that has to be relative to like where, for example, Volleyball Canada is. So, you know, for wherever you are, if you look at teams that are a bit above you, but also look at, so in this, relevant to this context, it would be looking at teams that came up a bit short of the Olympics, Canada being one of them in this case. And
Colombia just lost out to Argentina, and they're ranked right behind us. Well, good team to look at.
Looking at a team like Colombia who just missed on it, looking at another NORCECA team like Puerto Rico who just missed out on them, looking at
Thailand. I mean, they just lost. They missed out to South Korea.
Yep, looking at a team like Thailand, looking at a team like Netherlands who just missed out. Rule number 1, don't fire Jamie Morrison right before the Olympic qualifier. That might have helped you be a little more successful there. Yeah.
That's a whole nother podcast, I think.
Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast. Jamie, Volleycast supports you out there, buddy. Okay. So, yeah, of course. So, yeah, I mean, just looking at those other things because you may find that, for example, hey, like this piece of the profile is almost exactly the same between the teams that didn't make it, the teams that did, and the teams that made it. Maybe they're just a little bit better. Maybe they're not like categorically different. They're just a little bit better in those areas. Okay, then that area, we just got to get better in that area, and it's not necessarily a categorical change that needs to be made. It's just improving at volleyball. But these pieces are, you know, like for example, you may see that, there's this pretty clear difference in that teams that just miss out on making the Olympics, like I'm just pulling this out of my butt, but like teams that just miss out on making the Olympics, they rely a lot more on their transition offense, and they get a much higher proportion of kills in transition. Whereas the teams that made the Olympics, they have a much higher proportion of their kills in first ball offense. So that tells us it would be a mistake to bank on our transition game, and we should focus more on being an elite first ball team. That's a pure hypothetical. Like I'm not saying that is the answer, but like
no, but that's a really honestly that's probably a perspective I haven't. You know, we've looked at, okay, you know, when you're looking at a team, you're looking at maybe a lower ranked team who's beat a higher ranked team. What are they doing? Were they doing well? But I've never looked at as, okay, who else has just missed out on the Olympics? Who else is in our boat? Are there any consistencies amongst those teams? I've honestly never thought about that perspective. That's really good. Good nugget, Joe.
At least I got one. At least I got one good nugget.
No, we got a couple.
That's all I'm good for. Cool.
Awesome.
All right.
I think that's about me. This is super helpful, and you're probably still going to get many nerdy questions from me as I start going about this. The whole, like, I love the point you made too about how much definitive data you have access to. I know we have the beauty of using Volleymetrics, but we're still really limited on what we can get access to. So I think that's the first thing. That's where I'm going to have to start, is what can I actually get my hands on, and go from there. But I think that's something that, I think about. I make it more complicated before I come back to what can I actually get my hands on, what can I actually find. So I need to start there. But really good stuff.
Cool. Well, we'll have to check in later and see how it's going.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you know. I'll keep you posted.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thanks for being willing to share this conversation with other coaches. I think this is like, so many coaches are trying to, like you are, trying to use this time to, like, okay, how can I look at all these little pieces so that I can be the best for my program when I get back? So just thanks for being willing to share all that. And we also got to get you back on and talk about the book that you got from me, Legacy. So we didn't even get a chance to talk about that. So that would be a fun podcast to talk about.
Yeah, next time.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So Shannon, thanks for coming on the Volleycast.
Thanks, Joe.
All the best up there. Stay safe up in Canada. And until next time.
Thank you.